Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at a to-do list that never seemed to shrink. At 72, she had imagined this stage of life would feel lighter, more freedom, more time for herself, but instead, she felt trapped. Not by work, not by responsibilities, but by the sheer weight of things she couldn't let go of. Old commitments, lingering guilt, cluttered spaces, each one stealing precious moments she'd never get back. What if the secret to more time wasn't about doing more, but about removing what no longer serves you? Today, we'll walk through 12 things you need to clear from your life to reclaim your time, energy, and joy. And it all starts with the one thing Margaret never realized was holding her back. 1. Excess physical clutter. The unseen time thief Margaret had always prided herself on keeping a tidy home. But over the years, her neatly arranged shelves had become storage units for memories, old gifts from friends, clothes she never wore, and stacks of papers she swore she'd organize one day. Every attempt to clean resulted in hours of sifting through keepsakes, getting lost in nostalgia. And the worst part, she was spending more time managing her belongings than actually enjoying life. It wasn't until she visited her friend Helen that she realized the truth. Helen, at 75, had embraced the art of minimalism, not in a cold, sterile way, but in a way that made her home feel light. "You know what I did?" Helen had said, pouring Margaret a cup of tea. "I stopped keeping things out of guilt. If it wasn't useful, beautiful, or bringing me joy, it had to go." That night, Margaret stood in front of her bookshelf. She picked up an old vase she never liked, but had kept because it was a gift. She ran her fingers over the stack of unread magazines. Slowly, she felt the weight of these items, not just on her shelves, but in her mind. Each item she let go of was a minute reclaimed, a burden lifted. Here's the simple truth: your home should serve you, not the other way around. If you're constantly shifting piles, tidying clutter, or feeling overwhelmed by things you don't use, you're spending more time managing your past than living in your present. Margaret took her first step that night, clearing just one shelf, but the feeling of lightness was addictive. Little by little, she created a home that felt like a place to live, not a museum of things she once cared about. 2. Outdated commitments. Saying yes when you should say no. For decades, Margaret had been the go-to person for everything. Need a last-minute volunteer? Margaret would step in. Organizing a family dinner? She'd plan it. And while she loved being involved, she had started to feel stretched too thin. The irony? She was retired and busier than ever. One afternoon, as she sat at her kitchen table, staring at a week packed with events she didn't want to attend, her daughter called. "Mom, when was the last time you had a whole day just for you?" Margaret paused. She couldn't remember. The truth is, we carry commitments long after they've stopped serving us. Sometimes out of habit, sometimes out of obligation. But every unnecessary yes steals time from what we love. If you find yourself feeling drained instead of fulfilled by your schedule, it might be time to reevaluate. Margaret decided to test this out. That week, she turned down a club meeting she no longer enjoyed and declined a distant relative's event she felt obligated to attend. Instead, she used that time to visit a new cafe and read a book that had been sitting untouched for months. The world didn't end, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like her time truly belonged to her. 3. Negative self-talk. The quiet thief of time. Margaret was in her garden when she caught herself doing it again. She had been trying to dig up an old flower bed, but her knees weren't as strong as they used to be. As she stood up, she muttered under her breath, "Ugh, I'm useless. I used to be able to do this without a second thought." And just like that, an entire afternoon was stolen, not by physical limitations, but by the downward spiral of negative thoughts that followed. We don't always realize it, but self-criticism is one of the biggest time wasters of all. It holds us back from trying new things, keeps us stuck in regret, and drains the joy from our accomplishments. The good news, we have the power to rewrite that script. Slowly, Margaret noticed a shift. Instead of spiraling into self-doubt, she started focusing on what she could do. She found easier ways to garden, She gave herself credit for small wins. And most importantly, she stopped wasting time being unkind to herself. 4. Toxic relationships. When holding on holds you back, Margaret always believed in loyalty. She had friendships spanning decades, family ties that ran deep, and a heart that found it hard to turn people away. But as the years passed, she noticed something: certain relationships left her feeling drained rather than uplifted. Take Evelyn, her childhood friend. They had known each other for over 50 years, but their conversations had turned into one-sided venting sessions. Every call was filled with complaints, negativity, and criticisms about the world, about other people, and sometimes even about Margaret herself. And yet, out of obligation, she kept picking up the phone. It wasn't until an afternoon coffee with her neighbor, Grace, that Margaret saw the contrast. Grace was warm, encouraging, and full of laughter. An hour with her felt light. That's when she realized that time is too precious to spend on relationships that bring more harm than joy. Margaret didn't need to cut Evelyn out completely, but she did start making changes. She stopped answering out of guilt and began choosing when and if she wanted to engage. Slowly, she shifted her focus to the people who made her feel energized rather than exhausted. It wasn't about abandoning anyone, it was about protecting her peace. And here's the truth: not all relationships are meant to last forever. Some people fit one chapter of our lives, but not the next. The moment Margaret allowed herself to release what drained her, she found herself with more time for meaningful, fulfilling connections. 5. Unfinished projects. The weight of one day. There was a box in Margaret's spare room, a box filled with half-finished knitting projects, an old scrapbook she once started, and a stack of books she had been meaning to read for years. Every time she walked past it, she felt a small pang of guilt. I should finish that. I started it after all. But weeks turned to months, and months turned to years. One day she finally sat down and pulled everything out. She held up a half-knitted scarf, realizing she no longer even remembered what stitch she had used. She flipped through the scrapbook, pages still blank, memories she had planned to document, but never did. That's when it hit her. Not finishing something doesn't mean failure. It means it's no longer meant to be finished. Some things serve a purpose for a season, and then they don't. And carrying them forward doesn't bring joy, it brings weight. Margaret made a decision. The knitting projects. She donated them to a local craft group that would finish them with love. The scrapbook? She passed it on to her granddaughter, who was eager to start her own. The books? She chose just one to read, and let the rest go. And just like that, the guilt disappeared. We often underestimate how much unfinished projects steal from us. Not just space, but mental energy. Every undone task lingers in the background, whispering, "You should be working on me." But the truth is, if you wanted to finish it, you would have. Margaret learned that letting go wasn't giving up. It was making room for the things she truly cared about now. 6. Unrealistic expectations. The pressure to be who you once were. Margaret used to host the most wonderful holiday dinners, the kind where the table was set just right, homemade dishes covered every inch, and guests left feeling full, both in the stomach and in the heart. But now, the thought of preparing an elaborate meal felt exhausting. Yet, every year she pushed herself to do it anyway, because that's what she had always done. Until last Thanksgiving, when her daughter pulled her aside. "Mom, why don't we just order dinner this year? You don't need to do all this." Margaret resisted at first. What would people think? Wouldn't it be less special? But then she thought about it. Why was she clinging so tightly to an expectation that no longer fit her life? That year they ordered a beautiful meal from a local restaurant. And you know what? Nothing was lost. The laughter was the same. The warmth was the same. The love was the same. But this time, Margaret got to sit down, relax, and enjoy it. Unrealistic expectations rob us of joy. The pressure to be as active, as involved, and as capable as we once were can be suffocating. But life isn't about keeping up. It's about adapting. Margaret learned to release the pressure. She stopped forcing herself to be the host, the planner, the perfectionist, and in doing so she found something even more valuable. Ease. 7. Draining routines. The daily habits that steal your joy. Margaret had a morning routine. Wake up, check emails, skim the news, make coffee, and scroll through social media while finishing breakfast. It felt like something to do, a way to stay informed and connected. But one day, as she closed her laptop, after reading yet another round of bad news, she felt exhausted, and it wasn't even 9 a.m. She thought back to how mornings used to feel when she was younger. There was no rush to check headlines, no endless notifications pulling her in. She used to sit by the window, sip her tea slowly, and listen to the world wake up. That's when it hit her. Not all routines serve us forever. Some habits were formed out of necessity, others out of habit, but routines should make life easier, not heavier. She decided to experiment. The next morning, instead of checking emails first thing, she opened the window and listened to the birds. She swapped mindless scrolling for mindful journaling, and instead of letting news headlines dictate her mood, she started the day with music. The shift was subtle but powerful. The mornings that once drained her now filled her up. If your daily routines leave you feeling empty rather than energized, it might be time to ask, is this truly serving me? Or is it just something I do? The beauty of aging is that we have the wisdom to edit our lives, to keep what enriches us, and release what doesn't. And for Margaret, that simple change gave her back something priceless: peace. 8. Comparing to the past. The silent thief of happiness. Margaret was at the park when she overheard a conversation between two women her age. I used to walk 3 miles every morning, one said. Now I barely make it around the block. The other sighed. Tell me about it. I used to cook big meals every night. Now I just heat something. Margaret understood. She too had spent years measuring her present against her past. There was a time when she could garden for hours without feeling stiff the next day. A time when she could lift her grandkids with ease. A time when she could do more. But one afternoon she sat down with her old photo albums. Flipping through the pages, she saw herself in every stage of life. Young, strong, busy. And then she noticed something. In none of those photos was she looking back. She was simply living. That's when she realized, the past is a place to visit, not a place to live. She decided to change the way she measured life. Instead of comparing herself to who she used to be, she focused on who she was becoming. Instead of lamenting that she couldn't walk 3 miles anymore, she celebrated that she could still enjoy a stroll. Instead of regretting that she no longer cooked elaborate meals, she appreciated the simplicity of sharing a meal with loved ones, no matter how it was prepared. Comparison, whether to others or our younger selves, steals the joy of the present. But when we let go of that invisible scorecard, we free ourselves to embrace the beauty of now. 9. Social obligations that feel like chores. Prioritizing what truly matters. Margaret had always been a people pleaser. She was the one who never missed a birthday party, who always said yes to coffee dates, who felt guilty turning down invitations even when she didn't want to go. One Sunday, she found herself dreading an afternoon gathering with an old social group. She used to enjoy their meetups, but lately the conversations felt repetitive and the company uninspiring. Still, she went because that's what she had always done. But as she sat there, nodding along to yet another discussion about someone else's drama, she had a realization: why am I spending time where I don't want to be? That night she made a decision. She wasn't going to stop being social, far from it, but she was going to be intentional. And when the answer pointed toward no, she permitted herself to decline without guilt. The result? She had more time for the people and activities that truly brought her joy. Afternoon gatherings were replaced with deep one-on-one conversations. Obligatory events were swapped for peaceful walks or creative pursuits. She felt lighter, freer, and in control of her own time again. Margaret didn't become a hermit. She simply learned that presence should be a gift, not a duty. And by choosing where to invest her time, she found herself feeling more connected than ever. 10. Guilt about resting. The unspoken pressure to stay busy. Margaret sat in her armchair, a cup of tea in her hands, the afternoon sun spilling onto the wooden floor. She had nowhere to be, nothing urgent to do, and yet an unsettling feeling crept in, the nagging thought that she should be doing something more productive. For years, she had equated rest with laziness. If she wasn't cooking, cleaning, or helping someone, she felt she wasn't useful. And wasn't that what life was about? Being needed, contributing? But then she thought about her mother, a woman who had worked tirelessly, always putting others first, never allowing herself a break. Margaret remembered how, even in her later years, her mother had struggled to simply sit and enjoy the moment, always feeling guilty for resting, always convinced she wasn't doing enough. Margaret didn't want that for herself, so she did something radical. She allowed herself to rest, guilt-free. She permitted herself to take an afternoon nap if she felt tired, to watch the birds outside her window without rushing to do the next task, to read for pleasure without feeling like she had to earn it. She realized something profound. Rest is not a reward, it's a necessity. The irony, once she let go of the guilt, she felt more energized and more present in her life. If you've ever felt guilty for taking it slow, ask yourself, who told you that you have to earn rest? Because the truth is, you don't. And the sooner you release that guilt, the sooner you'll truly enjoy the time you have. 11. Regret over past choices. Letting go of what can't be changed. Margaret lay in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, replaying old memories like scenes from a movie. The things she wished she had done differently, the words she wished she had said, the moments she could never get back. She thought about the friendships that had faded, the opportunities she had passed on, the mistakes she had made, and as much as she wanted to rewrite those pages of her life, she couldn't. Regret is a heavy thing. It clings to the heart, whispering what if and if only, but regret doesn't change the past. It only robs the present. One afternoon, while sorting through an old journal, Margaret found an entry from years ago. In it, she had written about a tough decision she had made, one she now regretted, but reading her own words, she saw something she had forgotten. At the time, she had done the best she could with what she knew. That's when she made a choice. Instead of holding on to regret, she was going to honor the wisdom she had gained from those experiences. She couldn't change what happened, but she could control what she carried forward. And just like that, regret lost its grip. The past had shaped her, but it did not define her. And with every regret she released, she made room for something new: forgiveness, acceptance, and peace. 12. Unnecessary worry about the future. Embracing the present moment. Margaret had always been a planner. She liked knowing what was next and having things in order. But as she got older, she found herself worrying about things she couldn't control. What if her health declined suddenly? What if she became a burden to her family? What if? One evening, her granddaughter sat beside her, playing with a bracelet on her wrist. "Grandma," she said, looking up, "do you ever just enjoy right now?" The question caught Margaret off guard. Of course she did, didn't she? That night, she sat outside and listened, the rustling trees, the distant laughter from a neighbor's yard, the cool air on her skin. And she realized she had been so busy preparing for the future that she was missing the life happening right in front of her. So, she made a shift. She still planned. Of course she did, but she stopped letting worry steal the joy of the present. Margaret still didn't have all the answers, but she no longer needed them. She was finally living, not just waiting for what came next. All right, let's be real. Margaret isn't some decluttering guru. She's just like you, figuring it out one step at a time. But look at her now, lighter, freer, finally in charge of her time, instead of letting it run away from her. So, what's the first thing you're clearing out? Drop it in the comments. I'll be here cheering you on with a virtual high five.